Yes.
Oh.
Okay, we are now recording.
All
So.
right, everybody, I want to introduce to you Victor Bien, Dr. Victor Bien, who is going to talk to us on the life of Immanuel Kant. Let's put our hands together for Victor Bien.
All right, thank you, people. I'll just get straight into it because Kant is an enormous subject and I only be able to touch on a little bit of it. So I can't afford to waste any time. Even to say the most simple things with Immanuel Kant takes a lot of words. He's a great German philosopher whose influence was and continues to be immense. He's born in Königsberg in East Prussia in 1724 and died there in 1804. So he basically is an 18th century philosopher and he just crept into the early 19th century. So it's about his philosophy and views. There's some pictures of him. The bottom picture there is where he lived, and there's a little interesting story of how he carried on in the place, which I'll tell in a minute.
You mean the house in the foreground or the castle in the background?
That house there.
Oh,
That
okay.
house there. There's another picture of him. He attracted enormous interest all over Europe, and they visited him and they consulted him. So there's a picture of him consulting some people that needed his advice. Königsberg is known today as Kaliningrad, which is next to the northeast border of Poland, near the coast of the Baltic Sea. So if you can visualise that. I don't have a map here. Kant was impressed by science and was a competent physicist, astronomer, geologist and mathematician. He was deeply influenced by David Hume, which I noted last time, and also by Rousseau. I drew most of the material of this talk from the notable book which greatly influenced my deconversion back in 1968, Six Secular Philosophers, written by Lewis White Beck, who's a professor of philosophy in a university over in America, and also some material from the encyclopedia DVD. The religious influence in Kant's life came from the sect known as the Pietists. Pietism was a religious movement in Germany, somewhat like the Methodists that we know today, which appeared later in England. The Pietists, or at least those Pietists close to Kant's own humble family, placed great and indeed almost exclusive emphasis upon upright behaviour and simple faith, and they had no truck with ritualism or theological disputes. However, later, when he attended school, he was exposed to a more excessive kind of pietism with an overemphasis upon public worship and on the depravity of little boys who did not gladly take to it. And it so bored and offended him that from that time on he never voluntarily entered the church and never had much good to say for the organised form of religion, though he remained abreast of theological literature. Now I'll move on to his philosophical ideas. Now, because Kant's philosophy is so massive and actually very technical, I won't go there. I'll sort of go to the end of his philosophy rather than at the beginning, because it's the application to religion of his philosophy that interests us today, especially the humanist society. But if we were a group of technical philosophers, we'd be interested in some of the technical thinking that he did. Now, when I talked about Bertrand Russell, I mentioned Principia Mathematica, and I said that book was almost unreadable for non-specialists. Well, Kant's book, his main book, Critique of Pure Reason, is almost unreadable for non-specialists, right? So his magnum opus, his top-level achievement, is very, very difficult to read. Righto. Now, there's some massive of his publications. And the ones that I've got in purple there are the ones which mainly concern us today, and mainly concern technical philosophy today as well. Now, there's too much stuff to read there. I was just showing you, conveying to you the mass of his writings. Enormous, enormous philosopher. Okay, so the major work of primary interest to us are the Critique of Pure Reason, the Critique of Practical Reason, the Critique of Judgment, and Religion Within the Limits of Reason Alone. They're the main ones. But some of the ones which are sort of peripheral to our interest is the Prolegomena for any future metaphysics, the fundamental principles of the metaphysics of morals, of ethics, the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, and the metaphysical foundations of natural science. So his most important book was the Critique of Pure Reason, published in 1781. This vast and difficult masterpiece, almost an understatement, of philosophy has one of its purposes to show that human knowledge is not able to extend to things which cannot be experienced. So, in other words, to have knowledge, and there's a technical sense to knowledge that Kant got onto, which I can only just mention, I can't sort of prove it. Now, in this respect, Kant's conclusions are somewhat like those of Hume, which I talked about last month, but are reached by a very different route. Kant denies that we can have any knowledge of God. Philosophers that believed that they could prove the existence of God, who believed that they had proved the existence of God, had transgressed the limits that Kant found in knowledge. Transgressed the limits of acquisition of knowledge. But instead of just writing off these proofs as illegitimate because they belong to metaphysics, and a lot of philosophers today tend to do that still, right? Kant showed by long and intricate arguments that the proofs for the existence of God are fallacious. Now that's quite different to say that it's just meaningless, like the logical positivists say, right? So it's quite different. Okay, so what are so he saw there are three arguments. He codified it down and he boiled it down to three arguments, three classical arguments for the existence of God. And Kant examined each one. They are the ontological proof, the cosmological proof, and the theological proof. Now, read from notes.
Teleological.
Teleological proof, or the argument from design. Now, I've got here read from notes. So, ontological argument. The ontological argument was invented by St. Anselm in the 11th century, but was rejected by St. Thomas Aquinas. It was revived in the 17th century by Descartes and was used by Spinoza. It is meant to prove the existence of God from the definition of God as a perfect being. Any characteristic, a predicate, which is implied by the definition of a thing, must apply to it. This is as the argument goes. A perfect being, the argument runs, must possess all perfection, for otherwise it would not be perfect. Existence is a perfection, therefore God exists. Right? Right? So, don't you think there's a bit of a sleight of hand there?
But that's what the Muslims were proposing at those things that we went to.
Exactly. Exactly. People today are still doing this argument, and that third one there, the teleological argument, they're the third one, which is the strongest argument, actually depends on this argument, the ontological one. I'll get to that in a moment. So just as a triangle that does not have three sides is self-contradictory concept, so also non-existent perfect being is said to be self-contradictory. Kant refutes this argument by showing that exists is not a predicate at all, and therefore it cannot be a predicate of a perfect being, even if a perfect being should in fact exist. Though in grammar the word existence is as good as a predicate as the word perfect, and each obeys all the grammatical rules for the use of adjectives, logically from the standpoint of how these words behave in inference, they are quite different. When one says of something that it exists, one is not attributing a property to it, as when he says it is blue or it is perfect. A concept of non-existent thing X contains all the predicates that the concept of an existing X contains, right? For existence is not a predicate contained in and therefore to be proved by a concept. Kant demonstrates this is sound, but it's very complicated. Kant is never easy to read. This is Lewis White Beck. So we shall present a modern version of the critique of the ontological argument, which is simpler and easier to follow. So the question is a judgment that asserts that something exists, example, cats exist, logically like the one that attributes a predicate to a thing, example, cats scratch? If they are not logically as well as grammatically similar, then exist is not a predicate that can be found by analysing another predicate, like perfect. Take, say, Professor C.D. Broad's true statement, cats scratch. We can reformulate the sentence and find that the person who makes it means one of the following things. A1, if there were cats, they would scratch. Or A2, there are cats and they do scratch. Now, on the assumption that exists is a predicate like scratches, let's translate the sentence cats exist. We get B1. If there were any cats, they do exist. Or there are cats and they do exist. Now, B1 is necessarily true whether there are cats or not. If there were cats, they would exist. Right? If there were cats, they would exist. So it would be true whether there are cats or no cats. And does not tell us that there are any cats. B2, which is there are cats and they do exist, tell us that there are cats twice. If a man says cats scratch and cats exist, he is saying something which is instructive. It gives us information, and which happens to be true, but which might have been false. Yet, if we think cat exists is logically like cat scratch, and if we think exists is a predicate like scratch, we would really be saying something uninstructive, B2, or something necessarily true, whether there are cats or not. So if we apply this paradigm to the judgment, God is perfect and God exists, translating as before, we get C1. If there were God, he would be perfect. There is a God and he is perfect. D1. If there were a God, he would exist. Or D2. There is a God and he exists. But none of these prove that God exists. D1 is a tautology and is true whether God exists or not. D2 merely tells us twice that God does exist. There is no way to go logically from C1 to C2 or from C1 to D2. Now C1 again is if there were a God, he would be perfect. And D2, there is a God and he exists. You can't. There's a logical gap there. So, Kant says that the error of the ontological argument therefore is as follows. If exists is a predicate, then all statements that things exist, like B1, B2, D1, D2, are either logically necessary or uninstructive. Uninstructive means that you're just saying it twice, merely repeating itself. But this is not the kind of truth we mean when we say a thing exists. To find out whether a thing exists, we have to examine facts, not just do logic. To find out if the statement that something exists is logically necessary, like A is A. Hence, the ontological argument, since it implies a false conclusion about how we get knowledge of existing things, is invalid. Right? So, that's Kant's, the basic case that Kant made, that it's not that the idea whether God exists or not is meaningless, but that the argument to say that he exists is fallacious argument. Now, this is quite important for the modern day, because British philosophy, which Richard Dawkins follows, has a tendency to say that faith is unreasonable, right? So it's not reasonable to believe in God. But on the continent, which to a great extent flows from Kant, he says that we can't prove that God exists, but we can have faith that God exists. And it's not an unreasonable thing to have faith in God. Now we'll come to that, and the basis for why he thinks that it's reasonable to have faith in God, but he also emphasizes that if you have faith in God, it doesn't prove that God exists, and you can't use that faith to exercise some sort of imperative on other people. God exists, therefore we should have Sharia law. That's completely invalid. That's invalid. You can have faith in God, but you can't use that to impose moral values on other people. We'll get to that in a minute. A cosmological argument. From the ontological argument, Kant passes on to the other two arguments, which are allegedly based on the facts of experience and not upon empty logic. The cosmological argument is one that argues from the existence of the world and to the existence of a necessary being as its cause or condition. In other words, it's the argument for first cause. You see, we get a chain of causes, right? So this causes, this causes, this causes, right? So then you sort of think, well, if we exist, something caused us to exist, and we exist because we live the ones, something caused the world to exist, and back, right to the very beginning, that cause must be God. The objection to this argument is that it would not, even if otherwise valid, lead to a conception of God. For first cause and necessary being are not equivalent to God unless first cause and necessary being are equivalent to perfect being, and perfect being must imply existing being. Hence, a crucial stage in this argument, the ontological argument, is surreptitiously introduced. It is one link in the chain, and when it breaks, the whole falls to the ground. That wipes out the second one, the cosmological. All right, let's have a look at the argument for design now. The physico-teleological argument, as Kant calls the argument from design, is already familiar to us from Hume's discussion. This proof, says Kant, deserves to be mentioned with respect. It is the oldest, the clearest, and most accordant with common reason of mankind. It enlivens the study of nature, it suggests ends and purposes, and extends our knowledge of nature by means of the guiding principle of a special unity, the principle of which is outside nature. Though knowledge gained under the guidance of the principle that all the parts of nature are interconnected under the law as if by a divine intelligence, the belief in a supreme author of nature acquires the force of irresistible conviction. So you have the likes of Hamza Totsi and many other people who say, you know, you secular atheists, you're being unreasonable, you just look at all the order, therefore God exists. Well, you know, when, see, the thing is that when I get confronted with people like that, I say to Totsi, look, the sort of arguments that you mount with so much passion and everything, which to some extent I admire, has been answered 250 years ago. It's here. I mean, you people don't read this stuff. Right. Nevertheless, the argument is logically no good. It's easy to see that it's a special case of the argument from effect, nature, to cause, God. And because that cosmological argument depends on the ontological argument, which you just discussed, it is to prove the existence of God. The teleological argument likewise falls. So, now this is an important sentence to read from Lewis Whitebeck. The conclusion of the critique of pure reason is therefore that no theoretically valid arguments for the existence of God can be given, because Kant thought that these were the only three possible rational arguments. The critique of pure reason did not, however, deny the existence of God, it only denied that we can know it. He said, I have found it necessary to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith. This sounds a good bit like some passage already quoted from Hume. Hume said that theology could not be based upon reason, and that if we would be religious, we should have to have recourse to faith. But though Hume and Kant sound as though they were saying the same thing, in fact that they were not. Hume contrasts reason with faith, and when he recommends faith, he knows that it will be taken with the proper grain of salt. Now you can substitute Richard Dawkins for Hume. Kant contrasts faith with knowledge, not with reason, because he believed that there was a reasonable form of faith, faith that a rational man could not fail to have and remain rational in tracing out the implications of his experience. Now when he talks about experience, he talks about all our experience, that because we're a self-conscious being, we experience the world in all sorts of ways, right? The implication that we have experienced. Such faith is rational, but it's not knowledge. Yet it is not blind faith that has no reasonable or reasoning standards and criteria, and that arises only from our emotions and sentiments. When Kant makes room for rational faith in his philosophy, it is without the sceptical and perhaps ironic attitude with which Hume had recommended faith just a few years earlier. Faith for Hume, as for most theologians, is something outside the realm of reason. Faith for Kant, on the other hand, is only one of the aspects of reason, the other being knowledge. And the critique for pure reason drilled into mind-numbing detail as how we acquire knowledge. So the critique of pure reason is that no theoretical valid argument for the existence of God can be given, because Kant thought that these were the only three possible rational arguments. The critique of pure reason did not deny the existence of God, it only denied that we could know it. He said, I have found it necessary to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith. Now just one thing about that. What he was saying, that if we did have knowledge that God existed, there could be no morality. You could only have true morality if you can only believe in God by faith. I've said all that. Rational faith is based on morality, not on science and speculative philosophy. We must therefore look briefly at Kant's ethical theory, as expounded in his second great work, The Critique of Practical Reason. Kant made a sharp distinction between actions which are moral and those which are merely proper or prudent. And that gives you a clue, because if we knew that God existed, and this God, you know, is like some of the dreadful rulers of days gone by, we wouldn't obey God's law because for moral reasons. we'd bloody obey the law because we'd have the shit scared out of us. Because if you didn't obey it, you'd be bumped off, right? So therefore, how could you possibly have morality if you knew God existed? Now, ethical theory. And got caught for an hour.
Gee, we shall must make this
Why are we motivated by our reason's acknowledgement of the moral law? Some would say it's because reason recognises the moral law as a law given by God, who will reward us for our obedience. But Kant says, no, this is not true, for this would obliterate the distinction between morality and prudence. It would make Christianity only the most enlightened form of selfishness, which is, pretty right on the mark, because Barry Williams, formerly of the Skeptics, said that religion is one of the greatest scams that has ever been perpetrated on mankind. And so you know what he was getting at? It's a scam because it promises you life after death if you behave. So, Kant
have you heard of a priest or someone who practices religion to that point ever dying really, truly, dying of hunger and poverty? They all have.
Yeah. Take your point, okay.
leave the questions till the end.
Yeah. I don't mind a few little interjections. With eternal rewards in the hereafter outweighing the advantages which might accrue to us in our earthly life if we were immoral but careful. In such a conception as this, there is no more moral worth in obeying God, whom we do not see, than in obeying a traffic policeman who we do see. So these philosophers, have a really sharp, ironical turn of phrase.
Just a question, how would you define virtue in this context?
You need to leave the questions till he's finished.
There is a point about virtue, I'm coming to it. I'll keep it in mind. Kant said that we respect the moral law because it is a law which we as reasonable beings legislate for ourselves. Now, those words there are already the beginning of modern democracy, just right there. You see, because it's self-determination, all that stuff of modern UN human rights and everything is, it's all there. These guys way back 250 years ago had it all there, and there's so many stupid people out there that still haven't got onto it. It's amazing. We are not merely subjects in the realm of the moral law, we are also sovereigns and legislators. See? Self-determination. In his political theory, he held that men could not be, he uses the word men because the whole idea of sexism and non-sexist language, of course, as you know, only came in not that long ago, okay? So you'll have to excuse people like Immanuel Kant. They use sexist language because that's how it's been like for a very long time. Could not be legitimately bound to laws imposed upon them by fear of the power of the state. Such laws make men slaves, not citizens. Laws are only valid to the extent that we participate in their establishment and thereby give free consent to them. Analogously, he said that the moral law binds us only by virtue of our free consent, which is shown in our participation in its establishment. Reason does not so much discover the moral law as decree it. No? We decree the moral law that we're going to obey, that we're going to abide by. The moral law is not only a law for reasonable beings, but a law reasonable beings give to themselves and voluntarily undertake to obey. Kant called this the concept of moral autonomy, or moral freedom from all laws which do not have their origin in our own reason. And that word autonomy, Kant also uses the word heteronomy. And so when you have Sharia law, that would be an example of heteronomy, because it comes from outside of human reason and it's declared by invalid reason, blah, 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 as some sort of revelation from Allah or something, right? It's no accident that Kant was a follower of Rousseau and believed in self-government by the people. He extended this concept, however, far beyond the political sphere and regarded the moral law as a law given by ourselves to ourselves. The concept of God as the source of moral law is replaced by the concept of ourselves as free rational beings, both sovereign and subject to the kingdom of morality. Now, it looks as though Kant has firmly banished the notion of God from any place in his ethical theory. Certainly has built a moral theory that is not based on any knowledge of God, indeed one that is not even built upon faith in God. Yet the stone that he has thrown out of the foundation is given an essential place in the superstructure. Let's see how Kant went about to re-establish and rehabilitate the concept of God. Now before I move off there, on that last line, Paul,
Yeah.
I've got, you'll see, virtue is not happiness, but is worthiness to be happy.
Worthiness to be happy.
Kant
Thank you.
is rehabilitating God. I'm getting onto this. He thought it inconceivable that in a rational world, moral values should be permanently out of concord with our other illegitimate values and inescapable desires, as they often seem to be in this vale of tears. Now, many people in places like Egypt and so forth would certainly be in a vale of tears, and certainly the West was for many long time a vale of tears. Only the Enlightenment that actually brought us to some reasonable sort of civil world today. So you have to have faith. The highest good in the world is not stark virtue. This is Kant. But happiness proportional to and dependent upon virtue. This is part of his ethical theory. So virtue is not happiness, but it's worthiness to be happy.
Just a simple, this worthiness to be happy, does that to you mean that it is okay for me to be me?
Whatever that may mean.
Whatever that may mean.
To be me.
Have you
No.
finished? Are you opening this up?
No, I'm just engaging just this point. I have to deal on that because there is a degree of complexity in this. So hopefully you won't cover it in discussion. There are a lot of words. I've basically covered all that, I think. Oh yeah. This bit here where it's not even a substitute for knowledge. Where is it? I've got it here. Right. It was therefore for the sake of morality that Kant denied knowledge in order to make room for faith. We covered that. The faith he provided a place for was not faith in contrast to reason, but faith as an adjunct to moral reason. It is rational, but it's not knowledge. We covered that, right? And then, this is Lewis White Beck. It is not even a substitute for knowledge. We do not go a certain distance towards God, as it were, along the path of knowledge, and then finish the journey by an act of faith, as in the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas. Right? This is the God of the gaps syndrome. We often criticise the Christians, blah blah, you can help things, and you get to a certain point you can't get any further, then you attribute God to it. So what Kant's talking about is not that, right? You've got to get this clear that Kant is not talking about that. The whole movement of the mind towards God, this is Kant, right? Not necessarily me, although I sympathise with this, especially that it deconverted me in '68, right? The whole movement of the mind towards God is from the beginning a morally motivated movement, not scientifically motivated or guided, not scientifically. So it's not about the world of facts. The resulting conception of God is wholly an ethical one. So on the ABC radio, there was a spokesman on philosopher's zone that argued that God is not a being. God is not a being. Now, when you look at conceptions of God, on the Facebook side and so on, the atheists and people like that often have pictures of this man in the sky with a very stern face and a beard and everything, dispensing laws and stuff, right? So the old man. So God is conceptualized as some sort of anthropomorphism. Okay. Now Kant says, it's not, that's just all rubbish, right? It's all rubbish. It's not like that at all. Not like that at all. That, I'm sort of dramatizing Kant's thinking.
It is theatrical.
Yes.
Wait till he's asking questions.
It's not scientific. The resulting conception of God is a wholly ethical. The only valid theology is an ethico-theology, and all the attributes we properly attribute to God are either moral, that is holiness, beneficence, justice, or are derived from those. This conception, Kant argues, is less anthropomorphic. So that visualization I conveyed of the man in the sky, that's a total anthropomorphism. The Bible actually talks about that sort of conceptualization. The Bible actually has a bit in there that actually says that sort of conceptualization of God is idolatry. That whole thing about the golden calf and so forth. That's actually idolatry. And so don't forget that Kant was a pietist, and so he was deeply brought up within a Christian environment. And when you're brought up within a paradigm which just covers everyone, it's very difficult to escape from it. And so you've got to appreciate that while Kant was an original thinker, you can't escape your upbringing and everything. It's almost impossible. Then those who use the argument from design, for we have a purely rational conception of moral attributes, independent of the embodiment in a human form. So there's a God, but there's no body. There's no you can't. Kant is saying you can't conceptualize a God as some sort of body. That's why there was that philosopher's zone program that was sort of bringing it out. Joe Gellinis, he brings out these things, and pricks up your ears and makes you want to listen. Holding this rational faith in God is the same thing as having true religion. Religion, he says, is the recognition of all duties as divine commands. Recognizing all duties as divine commands. We don't know it, right? We have faith that it's so. It's not that they are divine commands or that they owe the authority over us to there being decrees of a divine lawgiver who also created us. For in that event, we should have to know God before we could know what our duty is. And we do not know God, while even the most unphilosophical person knows his duty. Moreover, such a theory would be incompatible with moral self-government or autonomy. Religion is not the basis of morality. There you got it. The Christians say religion is the basis of morality. 250 years ago, Kant saying religion is not the basis for morality. But rather the contrary, religion is a rational attitude based upon morality. Rational attitude based upon morality. Religionism, right? Tracing out its ramifications in our conception of the world, we do not know. For this, it follows that there are no specifically religious duties. There is no duty, for instance, to believe in the existence of God, contra the Islamists. Morality and religion differ from each other in their formal structure and vocabulary, but not in their substance. Any religion that requires anything of man other than earnest and conscientious morality is mere superstition and idolatry. There you got it. Now, time's tight, so let's fly. 2 more pages. It's 20 pages. Right, Kant held that there is an evolutionary progress in morality from a state of nature in which there is war of each against all, The civil society in which men are held together in uneasy peace through the externally imposed decrees of a powerful ruler, to an ethical commonwealth or a community in which men, let's say people, hold themselves together by their reverence for law and by trying to treat each other as ends in themselves. Moral law is then regarded as if it were a divine command, and the ethical commonwealth is a people united by common allegiance to a supposed author of these commands, namely God. The ethical commonwealth is therefore the kingdom of God, or the church invisible. Now, that bit in purple there, treat each other as ends in themselves, is part of Kant's categorical imperative. The categorical imperative states that whatever you want to do, you've got to will that what you want to do, you can universalise it. In other words, you can will that what you want to do, that everyone else in the world can do that. And that's where the secular morality breaks down. We find it breaking down because, for example, we need to be, the majority of us need to be willingly law-abiding citizens. If a significant number of people in a community starts not being willingly abiding by the rule of law, we're in trouble. And we've seen how this trouble has happened in the global financial crisis. Malcolm Maiden wrote a very important piece in the business page after the global financial crisis. And he said the problem is that the big bankers and all those people in that financial world, none of them abide by the categorical imperative. They're all acting as total disregard that what they're doing can be universalised. Yeah? What the bankers were doing was using techniques to get money out of people in a totally unfair way. Now, if you universalise this and everyone started to behave like this, we wouldn't have a community. We'd just disintegrate. Kant talks about a priori. It's not a posteriori. That conclusion comes from logic. It comes before the event. And this is where the argument that the ethicist, ethical argument about the consequentialists, the utilitarians, right? You have moral laws and you examine the consequences. Now, that's a reasonable set of moral philosophy to adopt. But Kant is saying that in addition to that, there is an element of moral value which is a priori.
What does that mean?
A priori, it's logical, it comes before experience. It's true regardless of experience. It's something that you bring to experience. I'll come to that in the last slide.
Excuse me, I thought you started at 4 and I've got another appointment.
Okay, George. So you have that if you did not abide by this categorical imperative, that the category has a technical sense and I can't get into it, but you can see the bite in that principle. That's a principle of action. If you're trying to work out whether what you want to do is right or wrong, one test you would apply is to consider, can I imagine everyone else in the world adopting that principle of action? You're going to do something, so there's a principle of action that you want to do. Like the bankers say, well, we're going to try and shortchange as many of our customers and other people as possible, right? That's a principle that they adopted. It's been documented. They've been fined. They've been thrown into the clink for doing it, right? They were all doing it. But you couldn't prove it. Because you can't prove it, you can't put them in the clink. But we know that they were doing it. And that's what's wrong. So when everyone starts doing it, the whole caboodle will break down. One of the main reasons, as Malcolm Maden did in his articles, he showed that the whole global financial crisis collapsed because the majority of bankers were not abiding by the categorical imperative. They were ignoring that they could not. He said that's why you have to be secret. If you're trying to do something that you can't universalise, you have to make it secret. So when
I mean universalise.
in other words, that principle that you are adopting, that everyone else can take your example and behave the same. Right? Shorthand
Really,
way
if you ask for clarification, it only slows him down. All
You
right?
need
That's
to
all right.
clarify,
Take
you
a
don't know
note.
what he said.
No,
Yeah, no.
take a note and then ask.
Okay.
Then you
All
don't
right.
get his point.
Right, I'll finish. Now this is this is a slide I showed last time, and I'll finish up this point. And it's a tabulation of. I need to quickly introduce that Kant followed Aristotle, and so there was a lot of logical thinking that came from Aristotle. Kant himself is sort of like the modern day Aristotle, and everyone sort of referred back to him. Anyway, so he talks about a priori and a posteriori, which are logical and empirical. And then there are judgments. We make judgments whether something is a priori or a posteriori, and you can have an analytical judgment or a synthetic judgment. Now this starts to drill into the high-powered philosophy that Kant established, and which ultimately led to modern science and everything, and which I mentioned at the very start is really difficult stuff to read, but we get into it quickly. 6 times 5 equals 30 is an a priori statement, right? It's by definition. A bachelor is an unmarried man is is a definition, by definition, that's a true statement. It's a priori, it's logically based, right? And a sentence which is analytical is a sentence which are true by virtue of the meaning of terms. So, so you can make a judgment, and you make judgments that these sentences are analytic. Now, then you have sentences which are synthetic. Sentences which require experience as how the world works. They're synthetic sentences. The cat sat on the mat. You see a cat sat on the mat, or Affy's dog sits on the carpet. They are empirical statements, right? We are sitting on chairs. They're empirical statements. They are posteriori, right? They're empirical. The Earth orbits the Sun is also empirical. What Kant was interested in, prompted by David Hume, was David Hume said, you can't prove cause and effect. Cause and effect, he said, is constant conjunction, that example that I gave. So if you drop an apple, it falls to the ground, but next time you drop an apple, it might not fall on the ground. That sounds ridiculous, but you can say, if we went to Jupiter and you dropped the apple in Jupiter, the apple would drop on the ground. Hume says, this is Hume, right? This is before Immanuel Kant. You can't prove it. You can't get to Jupiter. How do you know that it will drop on the ground, right?
So things going into Jupiter.
This is where today, of course, we are going to Jupiter. And we are actually able to empirically confirm it. But we've got the benefit of modern science for that. But what Kant says to Hume, you see, Kant said, boy, Hume has really thrown a challenge to me. That's why he said it awoken me out of my dogmatic slumbers, and he really got into it, and that's why I mentioned.
There's some water, Victor.
Oh, thanks.
Oops,
Not on the keyboard.
Blinded.
Of course you were.
Yes.
You're looking good, Jill.
Looking very blue there.
Blinded.
I mentioned that Immanuel Kant. I showed that picture, with the church in the background and so forth. Well, anyway, towards the end of his life, he knew that his life was coming to an end, and his philosophy was still so massive, he had so much work to do, he adopted a very disciplined, rigorous regime. And so we all need to have a walk, you see, when we're doing heavy intellectual work. And
To keep the brain operating.
keep the brain operating. Well, back then, what he did was he used to go for a walk on a particular time of the day. And it became a legend. And to this day, we know about it because various people have reflected on it. And it was said that the housewives of Königsberg set their clock by Immanuel Kant's daily walk. And what he was doing was writing his critique of pure reason and those other critiques, just this total massive work. And even to this day, you know, some of the most intense critical philosophers, they drew into it, and you know, they're trying to wriggle out of its implications and everything, and you know, they attack it and everything, and they can't. It is a total masterpiece, and others who defend Immanuel Kant have written commentaries, and I was reading one for the purposes of this talk, that one of them, just one tiny point in the middle of things, you would think that was almost trivial, but it isn't, because it's almost like the whole philosophy hangs on this tiny little point, and if this point fell, the whole lot would be, you know, you just read it like, you know, some other piece of literature, just dismiss it and get on to something new. But no, you can't, he's got you, he really got you by the throat, you can't get out of it. And this commentator wrote 100 pages to give an exposition for the proof of this point. And that's because there was this, you know, the professional philosophers, they're all pretty aggressive and they're all trying to promote themselves, right, their philosophy and so on. So they have every reason to want to try and break it. They can't break it. To this day, it has not been broken. Anyway, that's getting off the subject. So there are certain things, like there is a statement that there is universal gravitation. Universal gravitation is something you sort of discover a posteriori. You've got to have experience, right? And the question Kant was asking is, can you put that statement into this box here? In other words, it becomes a priori. And in other words, to say to David Hume, I've got the solution to your problem, that you can't prove that cause and effect is something built into the nature of reality. And universal gravitation, he said, is one of those that you can put, you can transfer, it originally is there, right? It's clearly a posteriori, right? Gravity, you only know about gravity because if you trip over, you fall flat in your face, right? You know about gravity. So it's a posteriori, it's empirical. But he's saying that the law of gravity can be transferred a priori. That is the thing that is enormous, colossal. You can't put analytic over the a posteriori because that would be direct contradiction. But to put something which is a posteriori into a priori is not a direct contradiction, which I can't go into now. Kant also talked about perception and things in itself. I quickly want to get to this because Ian's here.
We're going to have to finish.
Yeah.
I don't want
see,
to just
the
carry
thing
on to
is-
half past. Why don't we just carry on to 6:30? You just want to go on and on and on.
We'll see. Anyway, reality, he says, is perceptions and its phenomenon, right? We get to know about the world through phenomenon. But Kant came up with the notion of noumenon. That is, you experience light and various things, and you wonder what the real thing is. Because I mean, is what we see, what is the real thing? Is there something behind what we see that causes what we see, right? How can we possibly prove that? You see, because we're tied up in our own bodies, right? So we get perceptions, we hear things and so on.
It's subjective, in other words.
It's subjective. But what he wanted to do is it possible to somehow to reach out, you know, how can you possibly do it? And he had this idea of the noumenon, and back then, of course, he didn't have modern science, but you can sort of see that the noumenon that Kant was talking about back then, we actually have it today, and the example is Higgs boson. right? This is the current, the real hot news. Okay? You cannot possibly directly have perception of the Higgs boson. So how can we say that the Higgs boson is true?
What's Higgs boson?
The Higgs boson is this fundamental particle that was all the hot rage last year.
Oh, okay, okay.
Its existence has been
Anyway,
proved.
yeah, we're
Yeah,
going to finish.
no, the point is that what's the logical difference between the Higgs boson and God? So that's what he's getting at. And you can say that reality, that a noumenon, what he thought was noumenon, because you can't experience it, and it's still in a sense noumenon. You can't directly experience it, but you can say we have knowledge. We have knowledge that there is a Higgs boson.
Deduce it.
But you can't have any knowledge about God. God is still beyond knowledge.
Exactly.
Anyway, that's where I finish. Thanks very much.
Now, thank you, Victor.
Sorry,
This
I
is-
took a quarter of an hour longer.
Yeah, this is